Hey there, folks. Long time no see, and by that I mean I can't really see any of you. It's a camera I'm talking to. But yes, it's finally time for me to address all the comments that have appeared on Fixing RWBY Part 3, which is RWBY Volume 1. Which, I have to say, guys, you guys outdid yourselves this time. Some excellent comments in here. Some questions that, honestly, I failed to address as a writer. I can admit, I have some failings here. But a lot of things I do need to fix and address, with the most prominent, of course, being Miss Weiss, which will come at the end of this video, because we had at least 5 people complain, maybe 6 people complain directly about her in big block paragraphs, and guys, I want to say like the latter 4 pages of this 12-page script are all about Weiss. At least in the comments. I have a lot of comments copied onto here, so I know what I'm reading. But yes, that'll be addressed at the end. But for everything else, I'm going to go in chronological order of when the comment was made. So let's get to it. The guy with the internets, I think he had about 3 different comments on here, so you'll see him repeatedly as his thoughts go on. Had a few critiques in general. He pictured Carden as more of an opportunist than a racist. Like, he might say racist things, but it's more that he can get away with it than it is about fairness versus humanity. And he also wanted Weiss's, the introduction of Weiss's racism to happen during the team formation ceremony. That I'll get to later, of course, back in the Weiss thing. I don't know if it would fit there or not, but Weiss, again, I'll address later. As for Carden, Carden has a lot going on under the hood, and I'll be carrying much of the same interpretation I had of him from Cardinal and the Hare, my fanfic surrounding him in Velvet. But there will, of course, be slight tweaks from that to actually make it fit more in line with actual canon RWBY. Less of a romantic edge, more of a dynamic beat to his racism issue. But the gist of it relates to his similar upbringing to Weiss. But whereas Weiss had a direct threat from the Faunus over the years, which makes her more vehement about the issue, Carden and his family were always lording over them with almost no repercussion. They were a minor noble family of sorts, so they really didn't get as much attention as the biggest dust producer in the entire planet. So Carden kind of has the feeling that he can just overpower any faunus that get in his way because they're naturally subservient in his mind. His are more a simplified and easy to understand prejudice, while Weiss, like I said, we'll get to. Bianca Mayer, I'm not entirely sure, yes, Bianca Mayer, had a wonderful series of comments, which, again, I'll go back to, relate to Weiss. But the very first one is a comment on the forest segment, where she didn't like that students getting attacked by wild animals in such a short time. She felt it was weird and contrived. They wander around in a forest for a little while, and immediately there are 3 unrelated animal attacks. Most animals wouldn't attack humans in the first place, and there really isn't a reason for the students to anger them. The way I'd handle it, Yang would still start with the chimpanzees, but RWBY and Weiss would sneak around. They'd still cooperate to get past things, like a canyon, and using the Nevermore to get over the canyon. And she made a great comment about how the pacing of this is more like the early Harry Potter books, where the main plot only really comes in at the beginning and the end, which is true for the actual volume itself when you look at it. And I try to stick true to that. But as for the animal segment, I think there might be some confusion about the rate at which the wildlife attacks people. And I'll be discussing it more below, but I wanted to make it be known that the animals attack people are more like obstacles than they are direct confrontations. Things that the students more or less need to avoid or deal with quickly to attain their goal. I'll get to the point about ambush predators and all that in a bit. At least I should be. If not, someone raise it in the comments and I'll directly address it down below. I wrote this at like 4 in the morning and decided to record it this morning. So I'm not the most lucid. Or I wasn't the most lucid when I wrote this. So I'll try to remember and cover it if I don't in this. The Blade Charge said that he didn't. He thinks that the drama carries on a bit much, and there was more complaint later on about the level of melodrama that goes on between people, and said it's more on par with high school shows. And I think maybe that's because they actually do spend actual time in the school environment, in my rendition. I mean, RWBY was deliberately set in a school setting for 3 volumes and never really did it ever feel relevant or fitting. I think what you're seeing in regards to that and how it naturally would have flowed with the plot and not been... I think what you're seeing in regard to that is how it naturally would have flowed from the plot, and not been forced into disjointed mess it became. The closest we actually get was the original Weiss arc, and that was all of 1 episode, or 1 book. However, Volume 1 was measured itself, it was 2 installments of the same episodic time period, the same block of time. But that was the closest we actually got to seeing them in a full school environment. Whereas here, I think there's a little more time for them to breathe in that school environment, and that creates a little more drama and tension there. Friendly Neighborhood Neocon had a few points to bring up. Most of them are compliments, so thank you, but 2 of them in particular were good criticism, and I think one of them was on Weiss again. Yeah, one of them was Weiss. Number 3 of your points is, what was Roman's fixed plan? He steals dust and frames the White Fang to divert the cops to save Neo. Again, can't wait to see how you explain this, and my response to that is, Roman is a thief, plain and simple. A high-class, well-connected, and organized thief, but ultimately just a really high-class thief. There doesn't really need to be anything more to his storyline. Now, he does have underlying motives and such, but they're more personal reasons. There's nothing exceptionally pushing him to do these things beyond his own desire to thieve. In number 4, you bring up that in the normal show, Weiss was built to care a lot about grades, and while I'm going to save a lot about Weiss till the very end, this is an interesting sort of side point, where you make a point that she's very much determined to get good grades, that one of the reasons she wants to team up with Pyrrha is to get good grades. She's hoped for extra credit after the breach. So, a better characterization, he says, is if Weiss went out of her way to find Atlas-funded, biased research that proves Faunus' inferiority and tries to scientifically justify her racism. That establishes that it establishes Atlas's racism and love for learning and research, which contribute to her worldview. But writing the most racist character as the smartest is extremely hard, and I don't fault you for leaving Weiss's greed out of it. If it's not too late, you could write up a small bit in your fixed Volume 2 where Weiss is just starting to consider Faunus as equals, and then comes across a racist Atlas research paper triggering her internal struggle. I am incredibly impressed by this thought process. It's something that I kind of skimmed over when I was going over it because it was something I took for granted in her character. Weiss is very focused on her grades. Incredibly focused. It's the reason I'm keeping in the bit why she wants to be with Pyrrha is for good grades. So I'm adding that in. I am officially adopting that because, holy crap, that is an incredible point. And the idea of her going out of her way initially to find the research that supports her worldview, and then later coming back to that similar research and having an internal struggle over it, that's a great point of character, and it actually lends itself towards what I'll be building towards with Weiss going forward. And again, I keep saying that. We'll be getting to Weiss later. Isaratu? Isarudo? Commented, where's Sun in this? I mean, I explained it in the video. He's really unnecessary for the plot to progress, and in fact, I admit I'm having struggles finding his place in volumes 2 and 3, I should say, because Sun's role doesn't really come in until later in the series. I mean, he's kind of pointless until volume 4, which by that point you need to have him established in order to be involved in volume 4. So you can kind of see there's a conundrum going down. And it's really weird because he's one of the show's most well-written characters. But he doesn't really play a role in the plot or anything. But then, on the flip side, in Volume 4, he's actually one of the worst-written characters, but he's actually more directly involved in Blake's plot. So I'm wondering if there's just some kind of weird balancing act going on here that I'm not aware of. But yes, I've been struggling to find where Sun actually fits in a coherent narrative for RWBY. Even though I love him as a character, he's a fantastic character. Strawberry Queen. The one thing that always bugged me in Volume 2 was how easily they forgive Blake, although I get them forgiving her for the White Fang thing, but not the whole line about being a faunus. That should have been something that had an impact, maybe have some of them still salty over that fact. And while this isn't really a direct criticism of my interpretation, I want to address it because it is something I need to keep in mind, and it is something that I think should come back in Volume 2 in some regard. The way I interpret the issue is that they're all starting with square one from each other at the end of Volume 1. Like they all acknowledge, okay, listen, we've been keeping secrets from each other, we've been kind of, we've now all found out some of the worst sides of each other. I think RWBY and Yang can easily recognize that Blake keeping her heritage a secret was important to her, especially with Weiss on the team. And while both of them are hurt, they're incredibly understanding people, so I don't think it's too big of an issue with them. I don't think it's a big betrayal of trust. They've only known each other a couple of months by the end of the show, or the season, so the trust built between them is still fledgling, and in that time it's easy for it to be more malleable and able to take a hit. Now, the big difference is going to be Weiss and Blake. Those are going to be the big center points, because obvious reasons. Weiss is not going to be the immediate friendly character that we saw in Volume 2. In fact, that was probably one of the biggest issues I had with Volume 2 when it first came out, is why the hell is Weiss being so nice to Blake? She was a former White Fang and is a faunus. And Weiss has proven herself time and time again that she is both a racist and an anti-White Fang, I guess a White Fang detractor, is a better way to put it. So that's going to be significantly tweaked in the future. The guy with the internet had, again, bringing him back up, had an interesting thought about the Huntsman, and so his thoughts were on the lore of Huntsman, where he said, "So I get that Huntsmen are anything the kingdom wants them to be, and we agree to that point. Would transitioning away from monster hunting towards being the bolstering of government infrastructures be a point of friction in society? And this is very something that you can call upon even now with the militarization of police going on. Would the hunterization of military and police be an issue? With hunters being phased into more societal roles as opposed to being purely combative roles." And I thought that's an interesting subject. Well, I'm probably not going to touch upon it too much or focus upon it. What you bring up about militarization of Huntsman or vice versa is a very fascinating concept. And could certainly help build the unveiling of the Paladins when we get to Volume 2. I think that could be something integrated into Ironwood's speeches about it. So everything you raise here, and I suggest you guys look at the full comment. It's a very long, well thought out comment. I'm going to have to seriously sit down and see how well I can incorporate it into the underlying theme of the next installment of Fixing RWBY. So thanks for the ideas. Excellent ideas. I think integrating them would be great. This is the kind of comments that I wish Rooster Teeth would pay attention to and think about integrating into their show. So Rayon had a interesting comment, or a question, which is, do you plan on reducing the amount of mystic MacGuffins the show introduces in later seasons? The introduction of the Maidens felt a bit odd, but I was able to sort of accept it with the addition of the relics. But with the addition with the relics seemed really redundant to me, and the whole Silver Eyes thing seems to so disconnected from everything else, it felt forced and stupid. Dude, work on your punctuation. I'm trying to follow your comment here. But to answer that, I have no intention of removing those elements from the show, as really my opinion on them is that they are simply mismanaged by the creative team. I think with a steady hand, these elements could start to flesh out the more mystical aspects of the world, and now we're apparently learning more about them. I mean, we just had a big information dump in Volume 5, the first episode of Volume 5, about the role the maidens play in conjunction with the relics. So there is more there, it seems. I just think that the hints being left behind for them are being horribly mismanaged, and I'm holding out on how to introduce them properly, and I will comment on that later, because my entire perspective on fixing RWBY is I would have had all this thought out from the get-go. At least most of the main plot line and MacGuffins, I would have had them starting out, I would have had that all thought through to at least some extent. So I would be able to actually integrate those ideas. Now, the more we learn about it as the show goes on, the more I'll be able to come back and say, alright, I'm going to come back to Volume 2 and rectify things. I'm going to come back to Volume 1 and rectify things. I'm going to reintroduce things, or maybe I'll need to change things. The entire idea of fixing RWBY is it's very fluid, because the show itself is still ongoing. There will be more finalized thoughts whenever RWBY decides to conclude itself. Emerald Greens had a comment about how quickly it is RWBY got into trouble, and I have to agree. Yeah, the RWBY getting in trouble on the first day of classes seems kind of odd, especially because in back of my own mind it hit me that they really wouldn't be doing experiments with dust on the first day of classes. But showing a time scale change there could be rather difficult. It would all work down to how the scenes were presented. You could easily do a time swipes to show them going through classes multiple times. Really, it would depend on the direction of the episode itself, which is actually kind of an issue that's going to be cropping up later. But I think ultimately you raise a valid concern. Though you also kind of renege on it because you realize that there is the issue of how the pacing would work. So, conveying a significant time at Beacon while also conveying an immediacy to the action going on is a problem to tackle with the individual episode. So I thank you for raising that concern. I myself, I would probably have to go down and actually write out the episode proper in order to try and figure out how that would work, but I have other concerns I need to do, so I can't really get to it. I wish I could address your question in a much more fulfilling way, but just know that your concern at least has been logged. I am aware of it, and I will keep that in mind as I go forward with the writing of this series. I will try and keep in mind that the pacing needs to be kept in mind, but also the reality of the situation needs to be kept in mind as well. Toast Ghost 2.0. Really liked the video. I'm glad you liked it. Good to see you around. You've been commenter for quite a while. Same with that guy with the internets, and I think Rayon is a returning friendly neighborhood neocon I've seen around a couple of times. But you thought it didn't do enough, my version didn't do enough to show how close RWBY and Penny were. And that is something I'm going to try and focus on, establishing their relationship. So when we eventually get to, hopefully, what I think is going to be Penny dying. Again, I haven't exactly planned out Volume 3. I'm trying to go with self-contained volumes at this point. It's going to be very impactful when Penny leaves us for the plot. So building their relationship is of primary concern going forward, and finding a way to integrate Penny into the plot more often, I think, is important. I do think, though, I've done a better job than the actual show, because we've had, I think, 3 instances of interaction with them by the conclusion of Season 1. Which is better than the 2 instances of interaction we've had prior to that. I think. Yeah, I think Penny only shows up in the last 2 episodes, where she shows up in like 3 here, and has more extended screen time. And then you raise a valid concern about Ren and Nora being pushed into the background with the addition of Team Coffee. Well, I don't think that's necessarily the case. Your concern is noted, but I think this is where there's failings in the nature of summarizing the events instead of, showing the actual full show. There's a lot of background detail, sight gags, humorous bits that kind of fall to the wayside that don't need to get summarized for the sake of the plot. So Ren and Nora will have effectively the same amount of screen time as they did in the actual show, which meant, considering their percentage-wise, their screen time has gone down, but actual time length-wise, their screen time has maintained stagnance, and their interactions haven't changed at all. So, yeah, to say that, I could easily see why you think they might get buried, but there's a reason Nora is so bombastic. She doesn't really lend into any of the plot necessarily, her and Ren, but they're definitely a presence in the show. And I think they would maintain their presence and remain fan favorites going forward, in my rendition. I don't want to cut anything. I loved Ren and Nora all throughout Volume 1 through 3, and I still love them. Even through Volume 4, I love them. In fact, they were probably one of the best aspects of it. T.B. Pepper, talking about Blake being really antisocial, and how she struggles to ask to borrow a copy of Ninjas of Love, which is obviously some sort of boy love romance. But the idea of her and Tuxon having a more intimate in the platonic sense relationship, I think that's a really cute idea. I think everything you listed here, and now I hopefully I'm smart enough to put these comments up on screen. But I adore that idea. So thanks, and I'll be stealing that. I think it'd be a good point to open up Volume 2 on, actually. Or somewhere in Volume. CX3 gives a good comment about him looking forward, or her, I'm not sure, looking forward to me giving Yang's friends actual models and some dynamic in the background. And they were wondering if I was going to touch more upon Ruby's desire to cling to her sister and Yang's desire to have Ruby both come out of her shell and give Yang some space. If there was any more room to expand upon that, and honestly, that's a lot to lump onto Yang. And I think it was touched upon well enough here that it doesn't need to be super touched upon later on. Ruby's effectively gained an 8-person social group at this point that doesn't directly involve Yang, so I think that about solves the issue, though we'll see some repercussions to Ruby's awkward nature moving forward, and some lingering fear from Yang involving her Brahmin-blooded tendencies. These won't be big focal points, and I probably won't directly address anything about them until much later, like Volume 4 and 5, but there will be small holes in each volume for small details related to the subplot to be slotted in where it fits, much like a lot of the humor I intend would be able to be slotted in a lot of the holes that are presented in the summary. So that hopefully addresses your concern. And your next question was there a point to giving Neo a temporary illness? Was it just to keep her out of commission for a certain time, or did I miss something? Neo having a illness, that was partially a remnant of an older draft where Neo was actually dying from illness, and Torchwick's entire motive was to save her. It also makes sure that the villains of the volume had a trump card hanging up their sleeve to even the playing field. Obviously, the motive changed for Torchwick when I decided to make him a tried-and-true thief archetype, but the meta-narrative reason for keeping her out of commission still seemed to work well, so I kept it, and just downgraded it to something more like strep throat. So, yeah, it was mostly to keep her out of commission until such time as I needed a trump card for the villains. Feels a little skeevy, I know, as a writer, but I don't think it's a super important issue to focus on. And it does help illuminate the more father-daughter relationship her and Torchwick share. Though I've debated whether or not I should take it in different directions too. I think keeping it as father-daughter for now is an interesting dynamic for a thief duo. A stereotypical gamer had an interesting theory about Neo possibly being one of the former team members of Coco or Fox. I mean, you say Coco, but I would say Fox most likely because Fox's partner was disabled, and Coco's was outright killed. But I haven't really decided on Neo's backstory, and or if she and Roman really need to have one to fill their purpose. Keep in mind, I have a very vague backstory for how they met and their relationship, but as to the exact details of their backgrounds, I'm not sure how relevant that'll end up being. As for Velvet as a first year, because that was part of his theory, is that Velvet got moved up into Team Coffee to fill the slot that Neo once had. No, she's a straight up second year. And she's had Yatsu at her back the entire time. The only reason she eats lunch at a different time than them is because she has, she actually flunked out of history class, and she needs the remedial classes to keep up with it, and that's in a time slot for first years, so she has to eat with the first years in order to fulfill that credit. Now, why she flunked out of that, I haven't exactly played with that idea quite yet, but that is an event that happened. I like to think that it was of something that wasn't of her own doing, that there was some kind of outlying circumstance that prevented her from actually succeeding in the class. Stereotypical Gamer also comments that, questions why I did what I did with the forest, effectively. The same question as before, why use exotic animals instead of Grimm? And they have some fair criticism of, them being able to take on free armor Beowulfs, like RWBY can do on her own. And that it seems kind of unnecessary to have kids kill wild animals when pragmatic adaptation would have just used the young Beowulfs, which they'll be fighting all their lives anyway. And for real-life reasons, already had existing character models to mitigate the cost of increased budget the season would require. That's a fair criticism of the extra fauna I put in the show. That's a very fair criticism. Now, admittedly, the kids and their animals wouldn't be going out of their way to kill each other, but a lot of those animals are territorial or ambush predators. So it's more like obstacles and traps than it is direct confrontations for the students, things for them to avoid, whereas Grimm are more direct threats and actually life-threatening on a much deeper level. You also brought up the fact that why didn't Glinda or Ozpin notice the Grimm? And honestly, that's a failure on my part. I should have mentioned there should have been a scene. I should have added in a scene and mentioned it, that Ozpin and Glinda are probably alarmed at some point during the initiation that there are Grimm suddenly showing up. But I also think that's more of a fine detail. A fine detail that I should have mentioned. So it would have been added in the individual episode scripts, one of the individual episode scripts, but I gotta admit, I gotta stop relying on that as a backup. That was the intention for the humorous bits, but this is something that I should have mentioned, so thank you for calling me out on it. That is something I should have included. Ozpin and Glinda should have had a reaction to the Grimm in the forest, and should have had some kind of countermeasure attempted to say, bring the hunters home. So thank you for raising that good criticism. So 1000 Rogue Leader, good to see you again, and here's some of your criticisms. One, the John arc still feels needlessly unnecessary in this version. I prefer FamtanFalling's version better, where he just cut out entirely, or almost entirely. The show is about RWBY, not Jean. Adding the arc just drags down the show and acts like unnecessary padding. Which is the root problem with RWBY now, is that there's too much Jean. I think the John arc in my rendition manages to flesh out both Juniper and Ruby simultaneously while maintaining a fair balance between the two. Unlike the original version, which didn't really seem to have any balance at all, it was almost purely about John. And I'm not just John, but just John, not even Team Juniper, which my rendition, I didn't really touch on it, but I would imagine there's more interaction going on between Pyrrha, John, Nora, Ren. If I had to cut it for time, I probably would. But I still feel it's integral in getting the characters to the emotional places they need to go. Especially RWBY and Weiss. It kind of does a great job of setting up where they need to go emotionally. Which kind of brings me into RWBY versus Weiss, which you said that you think that RWBY should have won and have that be the learning experience for Weiss. I know I'm paraphrasing here, I'm trying to get the gist of it. My camera can only record in 30-minute chunks. Not 30 second, that'd be ridiculous. So I need to kind of rush along, make sure I get this in before it cuts out on me. You say that the story was originally set up with RWBY being a combat prodigy, and she is. And that Weiss has the technical ability, but not the raw experience. RWBY losing, though, is a very complicated scenario from a writing standpoint and for a narrative standpoint. For one, we need to show that RWBY is not perfect, and that Weiss for sure has some redeeming qualities in the form of her skill. It's also a reminder that RWBY has been moved up 2 years, and while she excels at combat, that doesn't mean she is the best at it. Additionally, Weiss drills weren't exactly easy. She did take on a Geist solo and won, and that's something that not even RWBY has accomplished through Volume 4. So there's merit to showing Weiss being a superior fighter. It also shows but it also allows the Make a God Bleed effect to slowly have a pull on Weiss. The reason I was specific about a close call for the two is that Weiss is outwardly arrogant but inwardly pensive, which can be conveyed with body language and behavior but not very effectively in summary. Weiss has been hurt. RWBY has almost completely shown her up, and it's having an effect on her mind. So it is still a catalyzing incident for Weiss's changing character, but outwardly Weiss is trying to make it feel as though she hasn't changed, that she is still in the right. Which I think ultimately makes her a more complicated character. She's trying to maintain her facade, while inside she's starting to feel pieces fall apart that she's built up because they haven't been properly stacked. Now your last comment that I'll get to that isn't Weiss related, I don't believe, but you comment that the schooling doesn't really make sense, and we could argue about this all day, but in my redrafts, huntsmen aren't solo hunters as you say they are. They are far more prevalent in society as relief workers, organizers, military attachés, and they do frequently operate in teams. They can go solo, but it's more so for maneuverability outside the kingdoms and stealth in more hostile territory than the dislike of working with a team, though some people do it because they dislike working with a team. There's all sorts of huntsmen. Additionally, what I outlined is only the first year experience, where team interaction is probably the most important, as being part of a team is intended to help keep everyone in the team alive until they're viable solo hunters. It's a necessity tactic for practical exam. You do, though, raise an interesting point of maybe having teams swap out at some point so that teammates can adapt to new old teammates can adapt to new teammates. They don't necessarily become static and start relying on one another out of necessity. And that's a great idea that I might build into in some way, or at least touch upon later on. So thank you for the idea. It's an excellent one to build from. The last comment from Dugaway the Internet's, Blake's cover has really started to bother him. And he's asking if I'm keeping the Chieftain ex-White Fang leader angle with her father, how no one recognized her, how Belladonna it could be an alias instead. But ultimately, I'll just give my thoughts on the matter after this. I think it's safe to say that Osmond knew from the get-go who Blake was. But the other is, it's not too unbelievable even with Weiss, though I admit it's pushing it. The way I have it is that Blake's dad is the third leader of the White Fang before he decides to step down, which probably happens 10 years prior to the series proper. Sienna Khan has been in charge for a while now and steadily grows more aggressive, which is why she becomes more the face of the group than any other previous leader. She's the most out there and forward member of the White Fang. Belladonna, meanwhile, enjoys a small, quiet life for that 10 years of respite, doing more gracious works for his community before being elected as chieftain. Now, what his job was before the White Fang and before the chieftain, I don't know what that would have been. Probably something physical with how huge he is. But, he's elected chieftain, and that probably happened some point while Blake is traveling to Menagerie. It's a very recent development by the time she arrives. And she probably actually learns in transit. That's at least the rough idea of it current. I might change it still. I could certainly use some feedback on the idea. But this puts Belladonna clan in a realm of unknown royalty. And if I change it so he becomes chieftain sooner, even then, do you know the name of the Russian Prime Minister? Tell me. Do you know him off the top of your head, without Googling it? How often do you pay attention to foreign politics? Because Blake could probably just go under the radar. Especially since he's not leader of the White Fang anymore. But, I mean, that's... I bounce that, guys, to you. I bounce that over to you guys, because obviously, when... Going back to the idea that, oh, I've technically would have started knowing a lot of this information from the get-go. Starting from there, I would have asked the question of... asked the question to you guys. You guys would be my bouncing team. I would be asking, I would have a team of people working with me, and I'd be bouncing ideas off of them, whether or not they thought it was a good idea or not, whether it made sense. So you guys are kind of like my sounding board for a lot of these ideas. So I want your feedback on the whole Belladonna situation. Mitchell Brown comments that he doesn't like what I did with Ruby herself as a leader. In the original show, while she eventually shows competence, it is repeatedly overshadowed by her lone wolf tendencies, which I would have doubled down on. Some of the changes in your decision I would have made were at the initiation, and while I would have left Juniper's part alone, I would have had Weiss be the one to pull the future Team Ruby aside so that they could form a plan. Osmond would pick Ruby as team leader because he could tell from a psych evaluation that she had to take upon her acceptance in the beacon, and her actions during the initiation, but that she wouldn't really put much effort into her team unless she was forced to. Ruby would not want the leadership role, but would do her best to try and fulfill it, leading into a slightly altered Coco scene where Ruby confesses that she doesn't see the point in even having a team because she doesn't want to be doesn't want one as a professional, and in fact prefers not to deal with people at all. I actually had a very in-depth discussion with Fatman about Ruby as a leader, and what he pointed out was that as a leader, all Ruby is really good at doing is giving herself the buff so that she can get the kill, whereas John was all about a more balanced strategy relying on each person sharing the glory. I found that an interesting dichotomy between the two, and decided to make it more of a point in the future of the series. When that'll show up, I'm not entirely sure yet, but it would obviously affect the fight scenes and the underlying team dynamics. But when it would be addressed directly is up in the air at the time being. But you raise an interesting point about Ruby wanting to be a solo hunter. I don't think that's necessarily the case, especially considering apparently how close Team Strike was, maybe? Getting some weird, conflicting messages from that. But you raised somewhat of a valid question there. To Weiss being the one with the plan during the forest, we've seen time and time again that Weiss is not very tactically minded. At least not in combat. And I think it's a very key part of her character that needs to grow. Eventually we'll see Weiss grow into the team's lead tactician, but for now she's too caught up in her own mind and pride to develop that skill properly. Befriending RWBY kind of helps breaks down that wall, and start the growing process all over again. Like I said, I'm doing my notes bullet point here. As for RWBY wanting to be a solo hunter, we kind of have some indication of that, but I don't think that necessarily rings true to her actual feelings. She wants to emulate her mother, but at the same time she doesn't want to be alone, which is a contradiction in terms that I want to see her struggle with as she develops as a huntress going forward. Again, there's some confusion with Team Strike and how close that team was operating together. You kind of go into what you want to see in Volume 2 and forward with Neo and Roman, and I want to say I have my own plans for Torchwick and Neo, so most of what you said there won't come to pass, but I do enjoy your idea of Penny interacting with Roman in a very cutesy way, so I'll at least entertain that and find a way to maybe integrate that into later volumes, later installments of Fixing RWBY. So Kumo Tanaka had a nitpick about the Velvet and Carton scenes, and they find racism as a serious problem, and I'm sure you understand that as well. The "I won't defend myself because I'm not going to fight hate with hate" line is a line I have issue with. Now hear me out, as a minority, there is nothing wrong with defending yourself from racists, especially if the violence escalates. Now this may be connected to Velvet's personal character, but I need to say that defending yourself from racist people and their harmful actions does not equal an eye for an eye hatred. You can fight back racism by standing up for yourself and your fellow man. I hate the idea that Velvet chooses to get treated unfairly by a racist to the point of blood being drawn as the right thing to do. So I'll confirm this now. This is more a reflection on Velvet as a character than the intent of the rework. Fighting racism, hell, fighting in self-defense are important matters to discuss. Velvet is simply more pacifistic against humans than she is against Grimm. She signed up to fight monsters, not people. That said, other characters like Blake ultimately do not take racism sitting down, and will call it out. Still, I think having the discussion of how far to go and when it comes to how far to go when it comes to violence, and how little is too little is a conversation everyone needs to have these days, especially with how political tensions are swelling globally. More on that will, of course, be touched upon later in this Fixing series. A man by the name of Flood commented that I don't find the whole swapping Cardinals papers gambit all that convincing. I mean, having fake papers isn't the problem with fake papers, it's the fact that the information is non-existent. All Cardin has to do is prove that his references are legitimate by contacting the schools he graduated from. That's the thing, it would still land Cardin in some hot water and be dangerous to his career. At best, it would place him on academic suspension while they got their act together. At worst, it would be an automatic expulsion due to fraud. John messing with the papers like that can be very dangerous in the legal world. Believe me, as someone who knows some legal jargon and stuff, messing with transcripts and stuff can get very dangerous. So there's certainly a threat there, at the very least, toward making Cardin's life a living hell, if not ruining his life entirely. I have Pepsi now. I am more powerful than you could ever imagine. Gotta love the power of jump cuts. So, Talker Dude Man brings serious concern with the fact that there is very little levity in my summary. And again, I'll read what I had written down, but it goes back to an earlier point. I think there's still plenty of room for levity that you can't really see in the broad summary like this. Nora and Ren are still in the background creating mayhem, RWBY is still an adorable klutz, Yang is typically perky and expressive, and Pyrrha is great at being soft and kind. So there's plenty of fun, goofy, and heartwarming moments to be had in order to offset the heavy weight of the show's plot, they simply just would have to be written into the individual scripts. They wouldn't be in the summary. So, again, I can hear your concerns, guys, but I wouldn't make RWBY super grim dark. I'll probably hint at its more serious nature a little earlier on than the actual show did, but at the end of the day, it started out being a lighthearted adventure action series, so I want to kind of reflect that. Socrates, or Socrates? How do you pronounce that? Socrates? Here's a good question of why Penny, a multi-Lean, highly classified android huntress, is running around without an escort. I like to think that something that's classified as that would have some escort like she did in the second and third volumes. You don't need to have uniformed soldiers, but another student or a full-fledged undercover Atlas specialist could have easily done that job without ruining her socialization. Heck, her entire team could have been with her to make sure nothing happened. Like I said, like I mentioned in my summary, Penny wonders if she's interpreting her father's words properly, and in fact, she was kind of rogue for the entirety of Volume 1. She wasn't supposed to be out on her own. And in Volume 2, obviously, she'll have Seal following her around or someone close to it. But, yeah, ultimately, Penny was just acting of her own volition and got loose. You can't always control teenagers, especially when they're cyborg, they're robot killing machines. So Loaf Hero had some interesting comments. This is one I actually wrote this morning, so I'm more lucid on it. Two of which are already going to be covered, or one of which has been covered, one will be covered in just a short second here, and two of which that I do need to address, which involve Velvet and Coffee. Commenting about John the way he handles Carden isn't very much. It's very much unheroic. It doesn't go along with the Velvet's view of being against an eye for an eye. And having John counter Carden's blackmail by blackmailing Carden back makes John even less likable character for stooping to Carden's level. Velvet being further bullied despite Coffee's presence is also a weird thing. And we'll get to this, is that Velvet isn't the be-all, end-all of morality here. In fact, I disagree with her choice of action, and it's, as I stated with the previous question, her more pacifistic tendencies are wholly character-driven. There's a fine line between being moral and effective, and Velvet knows where she has drawn her line, hazarding on the moral side to a fault. She encourages people to take the same stance as she asks of Blake, but she can't enforce that, and in fact others finding where their own lines are drawn is incredibly important in their own emotional development. John is designed to grow into a tactician, and instead of responding to a threat to his career with violence, he got creative and threatened back with equivalent force. I would argue that it doesn't make him less likable, and more so makes him more complex. He's willing to dive into a morally complex bog to enact justice, and I think that's more interesting going forward. The fact that he appears outwardly to be a kind of bumbling klutz of his own kind of lends more threat to him as a character, because he's willing to do different tactics than just punch a guy really hard. Let's see. But the beauty is, ultimately, you're free to have your own interpretation. You can like or dislike John. I honestly think that John has too much screen time. Not in my version, but in the old version. So I dislike him for that reason. But I don't dislike him if he manages to outsmart his opponent and get himself into a strategically advantageous position, or at least a strategically equivalent position to his opponent. And in fact, we already know that John is underhanded because he already forged the transcripts to get into Beacon. So, I think it's actually in character. It's in character with him back in the original Volume 1 for him to have done this. Now, you also mentioned that Coco not interfering with the Velvet and Carden situation is kind of a hypocritical stance, considering how she gave Ruby a spiel about getting involved at the right time. And you're right. Coco getting involved at the right time would have stopped Carden and Velvet, the whole situation between the two. But Coco didn't know. Velvet didn't tell her. And also, my face is really in the shadow here. Damn it, sun, don't ruin my lighting. I have no lights over here, too. That's kind of a downside to this room. But Coco wasn't aware of it. Remember, this is the first few months of the semester. This behavior hasn't been going on all that long. So to keep the peace, Velvet... this hasn't been going on very long, and Velvet knows that the kind of reprisal that would come if Coco learns of this. She knows that Carden will be walking out of the infirmary in casts at minimum. So, to keep the peace, she doesn't tell Coco, and she tries to quell any kind of talk about it among people. Does her best to cover it up. She doesn't want anyone to be hurt because of her. Remember, sometimes a leader is only as good as her subordinates let her be. So poor Coco, she just doesn't know. Alright. Folks, we are in the big one. We're in the Weiss corner. Whew, boy. I mean, you guys left me full frickin' essays on this. And it's taken me a while to kind of form my thoughts on the matter. But Gun Knight 777, War Clam, Whiskey II, or Whiskey, maybe? Shack 11, Patron of Dragons, any number of other people that I mentioned throughout the length of this that have mentioned Weiss and her racism and her unlikableness. And first things first, I did not see this coming. But then again, I guess I underestimated the lack of levity left behind by a simple summary. So I need to... I guess that needs to be put front and center in the next video, is that it's a summary, guys. The levity bits are probably going to be inserted in between. Or at least I need to integrate levity into the actual plot itself somehow, which that might be difficult. But I did not see this locus of dissent coming down on me. Then again, I guess I didn't make it quite clear. So it's probably best to make it clear now. Weiss is the secondary antagonist of this season. That was my intent from the get-go. Weiss is not meant to be a protagonist in this until the very end, where she flips side. She is an antagonist for the majority of the season, intentionally. She is a direct foil to RWBY herself, not a rival, but a polar opposite meant to challenge RWBY's way of life. So her being more aggressive and hostile is only natural to the territory. To speak to that, though, there are plenty of bits that I didn't include that would help humanize her. Like I mentioned earlier, the summary doesn't include a lot of smaller moments that help fill in more memorable parts of the characters. If you go purely by my summary, Ren and Nora barely get any screen time. But in reality, they have just as much as they did in the original show. So Weiss's funny, sweeter moments will be there. It's just dependent on how each individual episode is written. And this is an excuse I've been lying on a lot recently. I know you're probably annoyed at hearing that. But to give an example, Weiss's moment of saving RWBY in the forest. I kind of skimmed over it, but she does the same kind of similar heroic actions. She does manage to rescue RWBY. She's a little more hoity-toity and uptight about it, but we can see that she's really doesn't like RWBY. She begins out hating RWBY, but she doesn't want RWBY to die. She has a moral conscience. She's willing to protect someone she hates. So that could show you kind of where we're starting from, is that there's something underneath Weiss that compels her to protect people. So there's something there. There is something to a morality of Weiss, but it's buried under a lot of immorality. Now, the second big issue is her racism. And as for that, I wrote it very intentionally the way it is. Everyone's trying to come up with a way to change it, but Bianca Mayer actually wrote a very good response in defense of the way I've introduced Weiss's racism, or at the very least a defense of why I shouldn't change it to be something easily fixed. And it's an opinion that I very much agree with. People aren't raised with people are raised with wildly different ethics and morals, and it takes exposure to society at large to help smooth out some of the larger bumps, provided they don't just fall into an echo chamber for the rest of their lives. Giving Weiss a dead brother, making her ignorant, making her a strictly classist, those would rob Weiss of her defining prejudices, because those points can be easily avenged, disproven, or challenged. Racism is a very different beast all its own, something far more insidious, born from a natural, almost diabolical evil inside the human mind. We all have prejudice. We all have this evil inside of us, and most of us have learned how to beat it back in order to function in society, and the best of us have learned how to be self-reflective of it and try to act counter to it. I'm not immune. I've profiled people before, I do it constantly, but I'm aware of it and I try not to let it affect my actions, as difficult as that might be. Weiss is different. She's not self-aware, and because of that, the prejudices that she has inside of her have festered and corrupted other parts of her life where it shouldn't. She hasn't had a life where of people explaining compassion. She has had a life of people explaining opportunity and duplicity, while also pointing out other groups of people as the source for all that strife. This paranoia permeates her entire life, and to boil it down to simple terms would rob an issue of as dangerous as racism of its worth in a discussion. Weiss will be struggling with her own racist self for years to come, if not the remainder of her life, and that's something that I find infinitely more realistic, tragic, and oddly reassuring. Ultimately, I wanted to teach us that if someone as horrible as Weiss, so long as they're innocent of any actual crime, can redeem themselves, there's hope for all of us to overcome the worst in ourselves. That's the message I want to send, and why I think RWBY and Weiss are perfect foils. RWBY is the good person that wants to do good, and Weiss is the person with the power that doesn't know how to do good. And by pairing them together, one can gain the power she needs to enact change, while the other will change so as to enact power with maturity and benevolence. If we can all recognize the evil inside ourselves and work to overcome it, just a little bit each day, I'm sure our world would be a much better place. And ultimately, I think that's what Weiss represents. The potential for change, the potential for growth, and the absolute difficulty, the absolute mountain of a hurdle it is to get over that, but how worth it will be at the end. Feel free to disagree with me on the matter, but that's where I want to take the character. That's what I want to show. That's how I want to go with all of this. Is that RWBY is a show all about bringing out the best in people in their most dire straits, even from among the evil within themselves. With that, though, I have concluded every single comment up to this point on the video, at least all relevant comments. There's a lot of them in there that are just, oh, wow, great video, or wow, this was a terrible video. Things are just kind of bland and didn't need direct addressing. But these are the big points that I wanted to hit on and address. And I thank you all for watching. I hope you understand where I'm coming from with a lot of this. Please feel free to have discussion, calm, peaceful, and kindly discussion down below. I know the topic of racism is a very sensitive one, especially in these political times. So I'm hoping you'll all be very understanding of different worldviews going on below. I want to thank everyone for leaving these wonderful comments down below, because every single one helps me self-reflect and grow as a writer. And I want you all to understand that I'm still growing as a writer. I will make mistakes, and I will do my best to address them. These will always make me think more and more critically and more cautiously about how I write in the future. So thank you all so much for watching. A lovely shout out to my patrons, and invite for you guys to go to my Patreon page and subscribe to support this channel. And I will catch you all on the flip side.